Bienvenidas y bienvenidos al primer panel de las Jornadas Monetarias y Bancarias 2021 del BCRA. Condiciones macroeconómicas, crecimiento y distribución, problemas subyacentes de la economía global y lecciones de la pandemia. En este primer panel, titulado Política fiscal, crecimiento y desigualdad, debatiremos sobre el rol de la política fiscal en el crecimiento y en la reducción de la desigualdad acentuada durante la pandemia. Expondrán aquí el profesor Barry Eichengreen de la Universidad de California, Berkeley, la profesora Özlem Onaran de la Universidad de Greenwich y el profesor Mark Setterfield de The New School for Social Research. Y bienvenidos a la primera presentación del panel Política Fiscal, Crecimiento y Desigualdad de las Jornadas Monetarias y Bancarias 2021 del BCRA. Mi nombre es Germán Feldman, soy economista jefe del banco y me acompaña en esta ocasión Jorge Carrera, vicepresidente segundo del Banco Central. Esta presentación estará a cargo del profesor Barry Eichengreen. Barry Eichengreen es profesor de Economía y Ciencias Políticas en la Universidad de California, Berkeley, desde 1987 y miembro de reconocidos centros de investigación. Es doctor en Economía de la Universidad de Yale y doctor honoris causa de la Universidad Americana de París. Escribió varios libros sobre economía, globalización y desarrollo. Recibió varios reconocimientos por su labor académica, incluyendo el nombramiento como uno de los 100 principales pensadores globales por la revista Foreign Policy. Professor Eichengreen, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back at the Central Bank of Argentina. I have visited you before in person and hope to have the opportunity again in the future. My presentation is based on a brand new book, and it's concerned with public debt in historical perspective. I think the motivation will be straightforward. There has been something of a sea change or a shift in views of public debt in the last couple of years. Those of you of my age will recall the 1980s and 1990s when concern about unsustainable levels of public debt began to develop across the advanced country world and in many emerging markets as well. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget in the United States was formed in 1981. This public debt clock, which we used to be able to see when we could all assemble in Times Square in New York, went up, I think, around the same time, all reflecting concerns that public debts were on a dangerously unsustainable path. Those worries found themselves into the Maastricht Treaty on Economic and Monetary Union in Europe that led to the creation of the euro. They led to the 1990 Budget Enforcement Act in the United States, designed to limit the growth of federal government spending. So all of those measures were indicative of this worry that government spending and levels of public debt were dangerously out of control. Then came the global financial crisis, when this consensus at least wobbled. So in the United States, we saw the Obama stimulus, the $787 billion American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which caused federal government debt as a share of GDP to shoot up from 64% to 84% between 2008 and 2009. Various European countries saw even more dramatic increases in levels of public debt as they had to borrow in order to recapitalize their broken banking systems. But once recovery from the global financial crisis set in, and sometimes even before, governments turned back toward fiscal consolidation, back toward austerity, these events of 2008, 2009 were dismissed as no more than a temporary deviation from fiscal orthodoxy. But then came COVID-19. Now we are seeing governments running unprecedented deficits, accumulating unprecedented levels of debt. unprecedented, at least in peacetime. So the US federal government deficit is currently 15% of GDP. Countries famous for their fiscal austerity, like Germany, Germany abandoned its debt brake in favor of a deficit of more than 4% of GDP in 2020. Public debt Euro area wide is now more than 100% of GDP, far in excess of the 60% ceiling specified in the Maastricht Treaty. And we now witness the peculiar scene of European Commission officials traditionally the enforcers of austerity, cautioning European governments not to raise taxes or cut public spending prematurely, leading to two questions in my mind. Number one, is this change in attitudes and practices justified? And number two, will it last? So on the first question, I would argue clearly, yes, it is justified. Extraordinary circumstances, such as those of a global pandemic, when not only livelihoods, but the citizenry's very lives are at risk, justify extraordinary action. Think about it this way: a government that does not respond to this kind of emergency by mobilizing all available resources, including resources that can only be mobilized by issuing debt, will not long retain its legitimacy. People worried about public debt when cautioning against deficits reason by way of analogy with between the household budget constraint and the government budget constraint. I think that analogy in a way applies here as well. A government that doesn't borrow in order to provide essential services during a deadly pandemic would be accused of dereliction, and rightly so. Such a government, to continue with the analogy, would be like parents who refuse to borrow in order to obtain life-saving surgery for a child. Indeed, history shows us that states and rulers have long borrowed in order to meet emergencies, first and foremost in order to finance defensive wars, really defensive and offensive wars. So rulers have borrowed to expand their territories, but also to defend their territory against hostile invaders and to survive. Borrowing to mount that national defense strengthened the state in the material sense of successfully repelling foreign invaders, but also in a political sense, because a state that provided an adequate national defense was seen by the citizenry as legitimate, as providing an essential public service. Europe was the public debt pioneer because war was especially prevalent there. So here I show you a political map of Europe circa year 1200, when public borrowing by sovereigns really first began to emerge. The European continent was divided literally into hundreds of princely kingdoms, many only cities with modest hinterlands, some larger territories as well. And that political geography reflected Europe's physical geography as a land mass divided by mountain ranges and river valleys that posed natural obstacles to the formation of more extensive territorial states. So if you compare this picture with, say, China's physical geography, much of China, central and eastern China, is a great plain conducive to the emergence of a unified political system, a series of empires that ruled much of the subcontinent, quite in contrast to Europe. That's why public debt appears in Europe many centuries before it appears in China. So the story would go, debts were accumulated in wartime, they were paid off in times of peace, so that the sovereign and the state could start again with a clean financial slate and once more borrow when the next war broke out. That story is not quite accurate. It's sometimes accurate, as I will show you momentarily, but other times not. Increasingly, sovereign debt persisted. Levels of indebtedness incurred in times of war rose over the centuries as the state built up its debt carrying and debt servicing capacity, as the state built the economic, financial, and political infrastructure needed to service and maintain additional obligations. There were and are obvious commitment problems because sovereign debt, it's called sovereign debt even today, because it was the debt of the king or the sovereign, the supreme earthly power, not the debt of the state, but the debt of the individual occupying the throne, an individual with unlimited power that ironically limited his ability to borrow because there was nothing to prevent him from unilaterally reneging on his obligations. So it followed that sovereigns could borrow only short-term at relatively high interest rates, high single-digit or low double-digit real interest rates, typically. Kings might attempt to force loans on their subjects, but that could foment a rebellion. They might pledge collateral, the crown jewels, as to their foreign lenders, but loss of the crown jewels might fatally undermine regard for the sovereign, all of which meant that there were political, economic, and financial preconditions for accumulating and maintaining larger debts. So sovereign debt began its rise to modern levels, and sovereign borrowing costs began to decline to their now lower modern levels, only with the creation of representative assemblies in which the creditors sat, in which those creditors could acquire the power to oversee tax collection, approve increases in spending, authorize additional debt issuance. So we see the creation of those representative assemblies, first in Italian city-states like Florence, Genoa, Venice, compact polities where it's easy for representatives of the people to assemble in a building and carry out their functions. And over time in larger polities like the Netherlands and England. So on the right, I show you real interest rates for in Holland for public borrowing between 1600, when this process of creating a robust representative assembly got underway, through 1750. And you can see the quite dramatic decline in real borrowing costs in this particular case. And part and parcel with this process, imposing checks on the arbitrary power of the sovereign, sovereign debt comes to be recognized as an obligation of the state, rather than a personal obligation of the individual occupying the throne. So that's the political precondition. There were, of course, economic preconditions for rising sovereign debt levels. Not only did real interest rates come down, real borrowing costs come down, but real rates of economic growth went up. So with the commercial revolution in the 18th century, the industrial revolution in the 19th century. So if you've been following the debate over whether our now higher public debts are sustainable, you'll know about R minus G, the importance of the difference between the real interest rate on public debt and the rate, real rate of GDP growth. What I'm observing here is that R minus G came down, starting most dramatically, starting in the 19th century with modern economic growth. And my friend Paul Schmelzling has documented this, as I show you on the right. So in a sense, modern public finance and modern public debt levels are both corollaries of modern economic growth. In addition, to place public debt in private hands, there had to be an adequate population of individuals with savings to invest. So it's not surprising that we see the growth of the development of markets in public debt in places like Venice, Genoa, then later the Netherlands and Britain, which were the major naval and commercial powers of the day. And similarly, it's not surprising that we see the French towns that are pioneers in issuing municipal debt and in placing sovereign debt are the same places where the champagne fairs were held, the main commercial centers of medieval and early modern Europe, portrait of which I show you here on the right. And finally, there were financial preconditions for developing markets in public debt. Secondary markets on which debt securities could be traded had to be issued, and there had to be the establishment of an entity, a central bank. I'm aware that I'm speaking right now to a central bank to backstop this market, ensuring the stability and liquidity of the market in question. So I show you here a picture of the Bank of England case in point. All of which had spillovers to private markets. So you will be aware of the recent literature on the importance of safe assets, high quality public debt securities as kind of the foundation stone for private portfolios and the development and liquidity of private financial markets. We see the same thing in history as government debt securities came to be seen as safe and liquid. They were accepted as collateral for a variety of other private borrowing and lending transactions. So the growth of development of markets in public debt spurred the development of private financial markets and the broader process of economic and financial development. Scholars, economic historians are fond of asking, why was Europe first? Why was Europe first to experience commercial and industrial revolutions and modern economic growth? The fact that it was first in developing markets in public debt is not the entire story, but I would argue it's an important part of the story. Over time, the uses of public debt have evolved. Public debt continues to be important for war finance, and I show you here examples of that in the history of the United States. But increasingly over time, starting in the 19th century, governments borrowed in addition to finance economic development, the infrastructure needed for economic development, roads, railways, ports, urban lighting, sewers, and the like. There are prominent examples of that in Argentine history in the 19th century. And in the 20th century, governments began borrowing for social programs and to finance transfer payments. It makes sense to borrow to finance infrastructure investment because the returns to infrastructure investment accrue gradually over time, and those returns can be used to service the debt that was issued to finance those investments. It's less obviously sensible to issue debt to finance transfer payments. So the observation that governments have done that begs the question of why. And I think some elements of the answer include the tendency for demand for those transfer payments to rise precisely when revenues fall in bad economic times, political fractionalization and polarization in fractionalized and polarized political systems. Each political faction regards its preferred social programs as indispensable and can block efforts to cut them. Each political faction has just enough power to block taxes on itself, but not enough power to impose taxes on others. And finally, electoral uncertainty, that politicians will advocate more spending on their favored programs when they're in office because they fear they will be in a weaker position to push such spending later when they're no longer in office. So you will have observed probably the debate in the United States about whether we should spend an additional $3.5 trillion, part of which will presumably be debt financed on social infrastructure and climate change abatement programs. The Democrats in Congress are pushing that hard, in part because they fear they will lose their majorities in the 2022 midterm elections, case in point. So as a result of that increases in debt issuance, some for good reasons, some for bad, debts shot up, public debt acquired its bad name. Then came the public health emergency starting in March of 2020. It was widely seen as a crisis tantamount to war, and it elicited a warlike fiscal response. The question being whether this sea change in attitudes and actions, though justified, will persist. So we might ask if the change in the fiscal landscape is simply the product of COVID, and if COVID will end someday, then won't the intellectual tide go back out, and won't we go back to old attitudes toward what constitutes a sustainable public debt? I'm not so sure. I think, in fact, the change in attitudes predates COVID-19. Societies were already growing increasingly concerned about inequality and contemplating a more expansive role for the state. There was growing recognition of the need for government to provide public goods, social infrastructure, if you will, spending on education, healthcare, and so forth, that markets don't adequately supply. And the same argument that it may be justified to borrow now, incur additional debt in order to invest in high return physical infrastructure might apply to high investments in high return social infrastructure, early childhood education and the like as well. In addition, there's the argument that because interest rates on public debt have come down, are now heavier debts are sustainable. So the debt to GDP ratio in the United States has doubled since 2001, but our debt servicing costs as a share of GDP are no heavier because the interest rate on public debt has come down so dramatically. And as I show you on the right-hand side of this slide, the same is true for a variety of European countries as well. Given current low interest rates, there's no immediate crisis of debt sustainability, although debt in the hands of the public is above 100% now in the United States and in the Euro area as well. The argument would go because of the low implicit interest rate on public debt, the fiscal status quo can be allowed to persist. The question being, of course, whether these low interest rates themselves will persist. And the answer presumably depends on why you think interest rates on public debt are low. Because of Mr. Bernanke's global savings glut, because of increased life expectancy in the advanced countries, which means that people looking forward to a longer retirement feel compelled to save more while working, because of the shift from manufacturing to services and from factories to digital platforms, making for less physical investment. Mr. Summers' preferred explanation. It could be that some of these factors are now about to reverse. that savings rates in oil exporting economies will come down. Savings rates in China will come down with the development of a social safety net. There are a variety of such stories potentially pointing to higher government borrowing costs and higher implicit interest rates on public debt. So if interest rates do rise, debt consolidation will become more urgent. I here reproduce the simple debt dynamics equation where the change in the debt to GDP ratio, little d, between today times 0 and time capital T depends on primary surpluses as a share of GDP, P on the difference between the interest rate and the growth rate times the inherited stock of debt, and then on everything else like forced debt conversions and the like, the stock flow adjustment, SFA term on the far right. One can put that equation to work to look at some prominent debt consolidation episodes. So here I show you 3 from the 19th century, how Britain brought its public debt down from nearly 200% of GDP after the Napoleonic and French wars to nearly nothing, how the United States brought its debt to GDP ratio down to nearly nothing between after its Civil War and the eve of World War I, and how France brought down its Franco-Prussian public debt as a share of GDP very considerably after 1896 and as well. And you can see here in all 3 cases, this was done essentially entirely by running primary surpluses over a very long period of time. So that tells us something important, I think, about how fiscal consolidation in the past differed from fiscal consolidation today. Britain was able to run primary surpluses year after year for a century. How many economies today have a political economy that might make that possible? And I think in all of these cases, the explanation lies in part on the nature of the political system. In Britain, you had to be a man of property in order to vote. There was also the specter of a future war. There was pressure to retire inherited public debt to ensure that these countries had the fiscal capacity to borrow again if and when the next war came along. So Britain was looking forward to the danger of a future war with France or with Germany. France was looking forward to the danger of a future war with England or Germany similarly. So here I have 3 pictures that in the interest of time, I will skip over about look at the extent to which public debt in Britain came down over the 19th century. Same for the United States in the second half of the century. Same for France in the final couple of decades. After World War I, when politics were very different, when you had universal franchise or universal mail franchise in these countries, debt consolidation was much harder. It didn't happen in Britain. It happened in Germany, but not in a way that anyone would like to replicate. Namely, public debt was liquidated through hyperinflation because in a polarized political environment, it was impossible to reach agreement on what forms of public spending to cut or whose taxes to raise. And finally, we have this case of debt consolidation in the advanced economies after World War II, where public debts as a share of GDP were very successfully brought down. The precise periods differ in different countries, but basically the 3rd quarter of the 20th century. So people tell the story here is a story of financial repression, where interest rates were kept below economic growth rates. That certainly is part of the story, but there were also persistent, significant primary budget surpluses run in this period, partly enabled by successful economic growth, partly enabled by low levels of political polarization that contributed importantly to debt consolidation. So can those experiences be successfully replicated now? It would be hard. I think Ugo Panizza and I, some years back, looked at the universe of countries that have run primary budget surpluses as large as 5% of GDP for as long as a decade. And we found only 3, Norway, Belgium, and Singapore, 3 very special cases. A country that discovered vast amounts of oil and natural gas in the North Sea and ran surpluses in order to sock away that money for future generations. A Belgium that had the highest debt to GDP ratio in Europe and was anxious to qualify for monetary union. So it ran large, persistent primary surpluses to convince its European partners that it would be a reliable Euro area member, and a Singapore that had touchy political relations with its former federation partner to the north, Malaysia, and a strong technocratic government that could put away large financial resources in a sovereign wealth fund to protect against contingencies. So that's all by way of saying I'm skeptical that countries are going to be able to manage and work down their heavy public debts by running such large primary surpluses. Other authors say countries are going to bring down their high public debts by running, surprising their publics with high rates of inflation, which in the advanced countries would mean 5 or 10% per annum rates of inflation. I don't think so. I think investors will adjust maturities. So the inflationary surprise would have to be larger than that. And I don't think central banks and political systems in the advanced countries will be prepared to go there. I think stability culture is now deeply ingrained in the central banking community. And I think bondholders, insurance companies, other creditors of governments are themselves a formidable lobby. And I don't think we're going to be able to simply grow our way out of these heavy public debt burdens, because investing in infrastructure, investing in digitization, time is going to be required in order to realize the payoff. So I show you here Colonel Dwight Eisenhower's in the 1920s. He was commissioned by the US Army to find out how long it would take to shift resources from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast of the United States, anticipating the possibility of a Pacific War. And it took him 3 weeks to drive across the country. So that's what led to our building the interstate highway system, which took 3 decades. And then it took more decades for the payoff to be realized. So I think this history and other history suggests that productivity accelerates in response to positive technology shocks, but only with long and variable lags. All of which, to conclude, suggests that there are no simple solutions to the debt problem we're now about to inherit, and you have to attack it on multiple fronts. History suggests that countries that have successfully addressed problems of debt sustainability without major economic, financial, and political dislocations have done so by maintaining stable financial conditions, by running primary surpluses, by turning to fiscal restraint when the time is right, by growing the economy, and maybe by engineering a modest 2 or 3% rate of inflation and avoiding a modest 2 or 3% rate of deflation, which makes fiscal consolidation correspondingly harder. And I think that history shows that failing to address the problem from all of these angles at the same time is a recipe for failure. So that's the conclusion of this volume, available at your favorite bookseller now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for excellent presentation. I want to say, as a representative of the Central Bank of Argentina, but also as a professor of economics, as a researcher, that is an honor for us to have your presence in these jornadas. Professor Eichengreen is one of the most distinguished economists in international and financial arena. And so I think this presentation, especially this presentation, is very useful for everybody, but especially for young researchers, young students, because as you show, you have this extraordinary capacity of using history to learn for the present and for the future. So this was really a very great presentation. Having said that, I want to profit to make a first question. And of course, when we think about that, we can think about an important country that is Japan. Japan has been a country, a special country case in the last 3 decades. In fact, it has been suffering a long period of stagnation after years of strong growth and a financial crisis. For some authors, Japan suffered a balance sheet crisis that forced the deleveraging of families and companies, and in doing that, it's necessary the increase in public debt. In that context, public debt to GDP has grown to a level that was unthinkable when I was young. The same happened with monetary aggregates. So my question is Japan an isolated and peculiar case, or is it a leading case for the future, for the rest of the future? I mean, what implies for the rest of the core advanced countries? Is Japan a mirror for US and Europe for the next future? Is the current situation of Japan a stationary state for modern mature economies?
So do you remember how Simon Kuznets used to start his lectures at Harvard? I had the pleasure of meeting him when I was a first-year assistant professor there. He would start, there are 4 kinds of economies in the world: advanced, developing, Argentina, and Japan. So Japan is a special case, clearly, and it does baffle. It baffled Simon Kuznets, and it baffles the rest of us. Some observations about Japan's 250% public debt to GDP ratio would be that that's gross public debt, and the Japanese government is famous for also having a lot of public assets. So if you look at net public debt, it's on the order of 150, not 250% of GDP. And for better or for worse, there are a bunch of other countries that are approaching that threshold as we now speak. And that 150% figure, my Japanese friends tell me, does not include, or the assets do not include the public debt that's owned by the Bank of Japan. So public debt in the hands of the public is lower still, obviously. Having said that, I think the Japanese experience, where they have been able over time to issue large amounts of public debt and maintain very low interest rates, is a bit extraordinary. There is an appetite on the part of the domestic public, the small savers, for Japanese government debt that seems to be quite unlike other countries. But the difference between Japan and the rest of us in terms of public debt used to be quite extraordinary. It no longer looks so extraordinary today.
Professor Eichengreen, thank you for your very interesting presentation. I would like to bring you to the issue of public debt sustainability in the case of emerging economies. We are open economies that suffer from the original sin, and therefore the public debt faces a currency mismatch, and the sustainability of public debt depends largely on the dynamics of the exchange rate, of the real exchange rate. Considering this and the fact that the exchange rate stability is, among other things, relevant in order to ensure or to avoid problems of public debt sustainability, what do you think of the kind of convenient, I wouldn't say optimal, but convenient monetary or exchange rate regime that may help to preserve the debt sustainability under these conditions?
Well, I have long been a proponent of some exchange rate flexibility in emerging markets, and I remain a proponent of that by and large. I would acknowledge the argument that my friend Jeffrey Frankel has long made, that there's no one exchange rate regime that is optimal for each and every country, each and every emerging market. I do think that the buffer that the ability to modify the exchange rate provides is important. I read Argentine history as instructive in that regard. So having a very rigid exchange rate paid for Argentina when the problem was disinflating, and then it ultimately came back to bite the country. So I think now that in terms of inflation, Argentina is a more normal country, it's appropriate for it to have a more normal exchange rate, as it now does. I would simply say sound and stable policies will make for a less volatile exchange rate. So sound debt management will deliver the kind of exchange rate behavior you want, and the kind of exchange rate behavior you want will in turn make it easier to maintain that sound debt management.
One important issue is what are the reasons of the growing role of debt in macroeconomics. And in a recent paper, empirical paper, we have been working with the relationship among inequality, political cycle, and especially polarization and public debt. And you in your presentation speak about Piketty, for example. It seems that in front of an increase in inequality, governments tend to use public debt to avoid other fiscal solutions. For example, increasing progressive taxation that almost normally have important political costs. Debt in this regard is helpful to increase social expenditure, avoiding, again, to finance this social expenditure with progressive taxation. Do you agree that inequality could be a reason for the current public debt increase? And in this case, if you have this increasing in debt to compensate, not to correct, not to solve the problem of inequality, is this situation sustainable?
So I do agree with that point. I would frame it a little bit differently. I would say that political polarization makes it hard to agree on a set of social programs and how to finance them. So you get instability in levels of spending and what the government is spending on, and you get inability to appropriately finance that spending. So in a polarized political environment, you're likely to have higher levels of debt. In a polarized political environment where you have electoral uncertainty, where the politicians in power want more spending on their preferred programs now because they fear they'll be out of office tomorrow, you get the same thing. I think inequality is a source of, it creates a more polarized political environment. I think inequality, by creating that more polarized political environment, contributes to the electoral uncertainty. So I do think that interpretation is appropriate. And some of the cases where, to the contrary, we have seen primary budget surpluses and governments succeeding in bringing down high levels of public debt, those are environments where we observe less political polarization. So the United States in the third quarter of the 20th century was better able to balance its budget than it became subsequently. And if you look at statistics on polarization within the Congress, levels of polarization were less than they became subsequently. European politics were less polarized, and inequality was less in Europe in the third quarter of the 20th century than it became subsequently. So yes, I think those factors go together.
Professor Eichengreen, thank you very much again for participating in our annual conference. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure.